Hello everyone, Mike Lee here to give you an update on the newly formed OOA team at the Schrammeller Commons. It's been very exciting to see the various Schrammeller schools of practice, if you will, working together on this effort. As you might expect, they don't always agree on the details, but they do all agree on the basic principles that lead us, as a community, more towards engineering software than crafting it. So let's take a look at what we've been up to, okay?
The Schrammeller team was one of 3 teams created to initiate the Schrammeller Commons effort. Of course, the other 2 are the community team and the RD translation team. Our primary focus, as indicated by our charter, is on maintaining the OOA modeling portion of the method, recognizing that different variants or schools of practice have developed over the years. And here are the initial goals we set for ourselves. First of all, identify the body of knowledge for OOA, i.e., what exactly is it we're maintaining. Next, identify the necessary activities and processes for doing that maintenance. And finally, address a few issues to vet and refine our approach and see how we're doing, hopefully improve it. But first things first. Before we could get to work on those goals, we needed to set up an infrastructure to provide a work environment for the team. We set up a very basic one to start with. It had 3 major components. The first one was a shared Google Drive. That was a place for us to share our process and working documents. Second component was a shared Google chat room. That was a place for us to carry on discussions, chats, when we were working on issues, when we were reviewing the processes, and so forth. It was a much more interactive environment than the Drive was. And finally, there was the one-fact issue database. We used that to capture issues with the method that we were later going to be working on. Now, if you're interested in accessing these documents, looking at the issues, or even getting involved in the OOA team's work, you're going to need to send a request to me so I can grant you access to these tools. That's just how the tools work. Now, we knew when we set this all up that it was going to be a very basic environment, but it has been quite sufficient to get us going. There is, however, room for improvement. We look forward to that improvement in the future. Now, a little bit of bookkeeping. This text that appeared at the bottom of the screen in red indicates that there is a document in the Google Drive that explains the contents of this slide in much more detail. So, for example, if you looked at the operational infrastructure document on the Google Drive, what you'd find is a description of each of these tools, how we plan to use it, the processes for using them, and a guide and references to using them. So we'll use this technique on the coming slides. So when you see this box at the bottom of the screen, you can drill down and find more information for the topic with that. All right, our first task is defining the OOA body of knowledge. Now, this was an essential first step for the team to be able to assess issues with the method, to maintain the method. After all, we need a reference against which to measure things, right? Okay, so we started with an informal OOA reference consisting of the published books and papers we had on the method. Pretty obvious first step. After a little bit of work on the first issue, we realized it would be helpful to organize these references into schools of practice based on the variants of Schrammeller that these schools practiced. This was really just a reflection of the different groups that were coming together to form the Schrammeller Commons. It also aligns pretty well with the work going on in the RD tooling team. So let's drill down a little bit on these schools of practice to see what we're talking about here. So the first one is a rather obvious one. It's the initial OOA. It consists of the books and papers published by Stephen Sally in the early PT days. The next school of practice is the Project Technology Mentor Graphics one. It has the executable UML Meller-Balzer book and internal Bridgepoint documents as needed as their references. Next is the Kennedy Carter Abstract Solutions School of Practice. It has the OOA 97 paper by Wilkie, Carter, and Francis, and the Model-Driven Architecture book by Raystrick et al. As its references. And finally, there's the Model Integration Realization School of Practice, which has the Executable UML book by Leon, and the Models to Code book with No Mysterious Gaps by Leon, Andrew, and Stephen. Okay, in the work on the informal OOA reference, it became obvious that it was also going to be important to have a more formal one that would allow us to do this work with a little more precision. So we identified the need for a formal reference as well. It's commonly called the OOA of OOA, or meta model, if you will. Serious task, certainly more serious than just listing a bunch of publications, but we think we can leverage a lot of the work that these different schools of practices have done, developing their own meta models. And a proposal is actually being prepared now for doing that work. So we're looking forward to seeing that and moving forward on that front as well. After defining the book of knowledge for OOA, our next goal was to identify the activities and processes associated with maintaining that reference. Now, the first activity we considered was that associated with addressing the issues raised against the method. We decided to initiate that activity with each school of practice preparing a position statement, clarifying exactly where they stood on this particular issue, and also why they stood where they stood on this issue. This gave us a firm foundation for initiating the review activity, working through the initial assessment, evaluations, deliberation, and final decision on what to do with the issue relative to the method. Now we'll look at that in more detail on the next slide. Now, while looking at this review activity, it also occurred to us that not all issues are going to lend themselves well to this type of resolution. Specifically, we think issues exist that may require more consideration and technical development before we can reach any resolution. Consider things like bridging or threads of control. We think this is going to take much more effort, certainly doable, but not well suited to just go through a review process and make a quick decision on it. So we did not define a process for the R&D activities. We will do that as we engage in the first one. Now, the last thing we needed to consider for our processes was who had the final decision authority with respect to maintaining the method. As we explained in the Commons kickoff meeting, we established an OOA council with that final decision authority. Their authority was derived from their valued contributions to the method over the years. Here are the members of the council. I expect they look familiar. And here's a picture of the council's official coffee mug. That instills confidence, doesn't it? Okay. Let's take a look at the issue resolution process in more detail and see exactly how that works. Issues are the mechanism for capturing anything that concerns maintaining the method. Note that they can come in a variety of flavors. They can be questions, they can be bug reports, they can be feature requests. The important point is, number one, we have a way to capture that input in an issue. And number two, that we have a process for addressing that issue. Our process for addressing issues goes through the following stages. The first stage is to open the issue. Anyone can create an issue against the method in the one-fact issue database. The next stage is to validate the issue. In this stage, the council vets the issue, makes sure it's a well-formed question, they have everything they need to address it. If they don't, they will assign it back to the person who opened the issue until they get a good understanding. After vetting, each school of practice will produce a position statement on the issue. The next stage is to evaluate the issue. The position statements are open now for assessment by the entire OOA team, who can express their opinions, ask questions, get on the chat room and discuss things with other members, and attempt to understand the different position statements and put their input in as well. After this stage, the next stage is to deliberate the issue. In this one, the council considers the information gathered in the last two stages and decides on a final resolution. The next stage is to develop a report. That report summarizes and explains the resolution that the council had come to. And finally, the issue is closed. When the issue is closed, the issue references the report, which explains its resolution, and the report references the issue. So now we close the loop. If you come across either the report or the issue, you can access the other. Now we should have a good idea of the OOA team's basic infrastructure and processes. The compulsory segment of this presentation is officially over now. Let's look more closely at the first few issues we addressed, how the process worked, and what the results were. Should be a little more entertaining. All right, we've identified the activities, we've defined processes for these activities. Now it's time to get to work and address a couple of the issues that have been raised against the method. We proceeded by asking each of the OOA team members to identify their personal top 3 issues that we could address. From that, we called a list of 3 to work on. The first one was event prioritization. This issue asked the question, should this be added to the modeling semantics? That is, should we allow the modelers to prioritize events? Now, the initial OOA implicitly disallowed this. It had 2 rules for events. One was sequencing them between communicating pairs, and the other had to do with self-directed events. Now, these weren't random rules. They were derived actually from a 1978 paper by Leslie Lamport on communicating state machines and ordering events in a distributed computer system. Now, all the schools of practice agreed that this was not necessary, and this led to a rather straightforward resolution. No change to the OOA reference was required here. All right, on to the second issue. That was association formalization. The question being asked here is, should this be required? That is, do you require referential attributes to formalize an association in the model? Now, the initial OOA required this based on Shalley's strong commitment to relational data theory. However, when we looked at the schools of practice, we found differing opinions. One school of practice said, yes, definitely, it should be required. We had 2 others saying, no, not really. We should make it optional. There are certainly times when you need it. There's certainly times when you want it. But there are also certain times when we don't think you should do it. A little bit challenging now to resolve this one, right? What are we going to do? What we chose to do was agree to disagree at this point. We'll talk about that in a little more detail on the next slide. Let's take a look at the final issue, polymorphic event issue. The question here was, how should this work? The different schools of practice definitely had different approaches to this. And the question was, how should we proceed from here? Now, we're just in the validate stage with this issue. We're working on documenting and clarifying the different positions of the different schools of practice. So there's not a lot to report here. So let's take a look at agreeing to disagree. What does this mean? Now, one of the compelling drivers behind xtUML days, and then the Schrammeller Commons, was the desire to rationalize the different Schrammeller variants. How do we fit them all together? Now, there are a couple approaches to rationalization. One is to homogenize things, standardize them, and identify one true path. You're either on the bus or you're off the bus. This is a very exclusive approach to rationalization. Another approach is to identify commonalities, identify differences, extend the method where you agree upon it, change a method where you agree upon it, and leave it alone otherwise. This is a much more inclusive approach. Now, the Schrammeller Commons is definitely based on inclusion, not exclusion. We really want to build a community. We want anyone who is applying the method to be part of the community, to participate, to learn from it, to contribute to it, and to grow rather than excluding people because they're not doing things in the right way. So this leads us to the latter approach to rationalizing events. But let's not fool ourselves. Inclusion is going to be a challenge. To do that, you're going to have to manage a couple things. You're going to need to manage the integrity of the method, the theory, if you will, with the practicalities of the numerous ways the method can be applied, or the practice. So here we have the classic theory versus practice conundrum, right? Now the theory for us relates to the OOA formalism, and the practice relates to the selective application of that formalism. Anyone who has attempted to take the Schrammeller approach on a project knows that there are a number of ways of proceeding. You have to consider how the method fits with the project. How much of the method can the project successfully absorb? What level of support can I get from management? What level of funding can I get? What does the cost benefit look for? And so on and so forth. There are just many things to consider when you're trying to balance theory versus practice. I think what's really important here is to recognize that they are separate considerations. We can consider the theory and the practice independently. Let's take a closer look at the process of maintaining the method and see what that means for us. So how does this work? What are the results of maintaining the method? Well, the first thing we do when we're looking at an issue is to consider the following. Is there an initial OOA precedent for this issue? Is the council in agreement on this issue? And finally, does the council's agreement, if they are in agreement, agree with the precedent? So once we've discerned these things, we can proceed accordingly. If there is agreement with the precedent, there's no change. We saw that on the first issue. If there's agreement against the precedent, we are in fact in a position to change something. If there's agreement without any precedent, well, then we simply extend the method, no problem there. And if there's no agreement, we document the differences. So what are the results of this? Well, there are two dimensions to look at. The first one is maintaining the method itself. For the informal reference, we're documenting each of these issue resolutions with reports. And you can see consolidating those over time, as we have a large set, into a annual report, if you will, like the OOA 96 report, OOA 97 report, and so forth. Likewise, on the formal reference, we would document that in the formal specifications. The other thing to consider here is we are also clarifying the schools of practice. We are clarifying them relative to the OOA reference itself. Where do they agree and where do they disagree? And we're also clarifying them relative to each other. Where do they agree and disagree? But where does this get us? Well, the first thing we get is maintenance of the method as we review the issues. Now, remember the three outcomes we had when we reviewed an issue. The first one was no change. In this situation, everyone agreed the precedent was fine. Let's stay with it. No change. The next one was to extend the method. In this case, we came upon something that there was no precedent for. We decided we had a good solution for it, and we added it to the OOA reference. Now, the third possibility was to change the method. Here, we found something in the method that everyone agreed we could do better. We made a change to it. No surprises here. That's what it means to maintain the method. And maintaining the method is in our charter. But what do we get from clarifying the different schools of practice? Let's take a look at what that will enable us to do, and I think you'll find it very valuable for the community. Clarifying the school of practice relative to the method enables us to evaluate a school of practice very effectively. Here's a Venn diagram showing school of practice XYZ relative to the OOA reference or method. Now, if you're responsible for evaluating a school of practice, relative to the method, this can be very valuable. It'll show you what method features are not supported. It'll be important not to have features in there that you need. It'll show you method features that are supported. If you have specific method features that you need for your project, you want to make sure you have them. And it also shows you school-specific features that are supported. A particular school of practice may have certain extensions that it's done that are very valuable for your project, and you might want to choose it based upon that. So all of this helps you know exactly what you're getting when you choose a particular school of practice. Clarifying the schools of practice relative to each other enables us to compare these schools of practice, a valuable capability. Here's a Venn diagram showing a couple schools of practice and the OOA reference relative to each other. Now, if you're responsible for evaluating one school of practice relative to another, this can be very valuable information. It'll show you where there are overlaps between the schools of practice. This is all goodness. It'll show you where there are differences between the school of practice, and you want to make sure the school of practice you're choosing has what you need relative to the other one. It'll show you the method support that each school of practice offers. Again, you want to make sure you're getting what you need out of the method. It'll also show you which extensions each school of practice has. You may find ones specific to a school of practice that are valuable for your project. You want to make sure to choose that school of practice. And stealing a little thunder from the RD tooling group, I think you'll also be able to assess the tooling support available from each school of practice. Now, all of this is going to help you choose the school of practice that best fits your needs. As we saw, maintaining the method accomplishes a couple of things. It keeps the method viable and relevant, and it clarifies where the schools of practice stand with respect to the method and each other. And both of these provide valuable benefits for the community. They help define the community, what we share, and where we differ. And they also provide valuable benefits for potential Schrammeller practitioners by answering the questions, what's this method all about? And how do the different schools of practice use the method? Of course, we're answering these questions in the form of a position statement and reports, a pretty technical and not necessarily accessible format, but more on that in a little bit. First, I'm going to complete the tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them loop. And for those of you that may have dozed off during the less entertaining sections of this presentation, wake up, here's the cheat sheet. All right, here are the takeaways we'd like you to have from today's presentation. We started with looking at the team's charter. You learn from that our primary purpose is to maintain the OOA method, and we do that by addressing issues that members of the community raise against the method. We looked at our working environment. From that, you learned how to access our work products and participate if you're interested. Next, we looked at the OOA reference for the method. We identified the need both for an informal and a formal reference. We also identified different schools of practice. Now, this is a very important organizing principle for our work, and it reflects the different variants of Schrammeller that each school practices. We looked at the review process. From that, you learned about the OOA Council and their decision-making authority with respect to the method, and we learned the different roles of the council and the team in the review process. Then we looked at 3 issues that we had addressed. We found that some things were easy to address. We had agreement. We also found that there were differences at times among the schools of practice on how to proceed on an issue. We resolved here to be inclusive when addressing these differences. Now, there's a challenge to that inclusion. We have to balance the theory with the practice, or the OOA formalism with the application of that formalism on real-world projects. Now, these are both important considerations, but they're also separate considerations and really do not need to conflict. Then we took a look at the review results, and what they could do for us. First, they could clarify both the method, which is what we set out to do, but also clarify the different schools of practice, how they related to the method and how they related to each other. We thought this added value both to the community and wannabes who were looking in on the community and trying to figure out if they wanted to pursue this or not. In that regard, we did ask ourselves about the accessibility of the results to wannabes. You're going to have to stay tuned for that takeaway. So that's what we've been up to. What next for the OOA team? Well, of course, we'll continue addressing issues raised by the community against the method. We'll write reports, we'll explain our positions, and so forth. Good work. But I think the next big thing we need to tackle is the formal OOA reference. I think we need to clarify its content. What's in it? What form? We need to identify the participants. Who's going to be doing this work? What are they bringing to the party? We'll need to develop a process. How are we going to go about doing this? And finally, of course, we'll need to kick off the work. Now, I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here, but Mark Balzer has volunteered to develop a proposal for this work. Really looking forward to it. Key piece of work there. Next, of course, I think getting more members involved would be great. Participants, of course, it'd be great to share the load, but also observers and critics to give us feedback on what we're doing. Now, to do that, I think we need a little bit more open infrastructure or working environment, which leads us to the next slide very conveniently. What next for Schrammeller Commons? Now, I have to warn you, this is an opinion piece. I'm totally outside my bailiwick, but I do have an opinion. I think we should continue to support the efforts of the initial 3 teams. They're off to a good start, but they still have a lot of work to do. I think we need to upgrade our operational infrastructure. It's very inefficient to work in. It tends to silo the different teams. And it makes it very difficult for other members of the community to observe what's going on, provide feedback, and participate if they want to. We can do better than that with tools available today. And now the question I've been deferring. Is the work we're doing accessible to wannabe? This is a critical question. It determines how well we're going to be able to grow this community. If we can't do this, we won't grow it. So is the work we're doing accessible? Well, actually, it's not. It's very technical. We're laying foundational work, but we're going to be moving beyond that. And to do that, I think we need to consider investing in making the method accessible. That means spinning up a team, the educational training team, and developing a distillation of Schrammeller. What are its principles? What are its values? What the benefits of using it? Basically, what's the elevator pitch that can convince someone they would want to dig deeper on this? Next, I think we need to invest in making the Schrammeller Commons visible. I've mentioned my work to a number of friends and colleagues over the last couple of months. Those familiar with the method are very excited, and they ask me, well, where can I go to look at this? Where can I see what you're up to? There's no place to point them to, is there? So I think we need to spin up the promotion communication team and focus them on a web portal so we have something to show for the work that we're doing. Yes, I think we've gotten off to a great start with the Schrammeller Commons, but I think we need to build on that momentum. We need to improve our accessibility. We need to prove our visibility. We can do this. Thank you.